thanks a lot. Thank you, Luca. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I work for KPMG. It's a consulting company. I'm a data scientist by background. And I'm going to use the time here to give my perspective about how companies are coping with ethical AI and how they are putting AI governance in practice across different industries. I'm going to try to share some lessons learned, something that I would consider general good principles that can be applied across industries. And I'm going to try to draw some conclusions in terms of like how these lessons learned impact the operationalization of ethical AI. But first of all, what is ethical AI? Ethical AI is, most often than not, consider the process of identifying ethical principles. So identifying principles that point the direction in terms of like what is good and what is bad. In reality, I find this definition restrictive in the sense that the identification of ethical principles is only the first step in a longer process. That also includes the need to translate those principles into technical requirements, the implementation of those requirements, and then their validation. So if we keep this broader definition of ethical AI, can we already draw some lessons learned? Well, one thing which is clear, and this is something that affects several industries, ethical AI and governance are something that are stressing people a lot. It's obvious, it's new. Regulation is also new. And there's a little bit of unclarity in terms of like how to do things. And there's also a backlog because regulation is going to also apply retrospectively and impact all of the already existing systems. There's also another element, which is, quoting Stanford University researchers, product managers frequently perceive responsible AI teams' activities as stalling product launches or putting revenue generation at risk. What does that mean? Well, companies invest into AI systems, they work on them, they are about to press the button and put the system at work in production, and then they have to go through the ethical AI audit. Well, it's clear that if ethical AI is taken into account and considered and worked on only right before a product launch, well, that's already too late. A good key lesson learned from my experience is that you have to include ethical requirements in your product, requirements as early as possible, okay? If you wait too much, you're going to face different risks. You're going to have tensions, that is clear. You're going to have reworks. I mean, you built something, you're going to have an ethical AI audit. They say it's not good, you're going to have to build it again. And then the third risk is a little bit more subtle, and that's the risk of a checkbox approach to ethics. What we're trying to say with the checkbox approach is you haven't discussed ethical AI, you are in front of a product launch, and it's the time you need to define what is ethical and what not. And it's time you define those ethical AI requirements, and you're going to just try to set the bar as low as possible so that you can tick the box and move forward. This is the first key lesson learned. And it's important to start the discussion as early as possible because if the validation of technical requirements is objective, it's checking the math, is proving axiomatic truths, the first part of this process, starting with ethical principles, is highly subjective. What I consider right, what I consider good, might not be what you consider right and what you consider wrong. The discussion around ethical principle then is about getting different stakeholders. You have to have technical teams, but also legal experts, governance experts, people from risk, and also diversity, because you can't have discussions, for example, about the fairness without involving diverse people in the conversation. So companies are trying to avoid the risk of getting stalled into a moral relativism debate. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to look at the regulation in order to distill principles. So the first way companies are looking at regulation is as a way to set those ethical principles. And there's a lot of regulation that goes beyond the EU AI Act that everybody's concerned about probably here. And we also have multinational companies that obviously need to be compliant across different geographies. So what they're trying to do is they look at all that regulation and they try to distill one unique set of principles. There are certain regulations that are less mature, but they're all working under the assumption that there's going to be some sort of anchoring. Anchoring is the idea that regulation is disruptive. Companies are already tackling some regulation, and if new regulation comes in, well, the regulators, they're going to try to benchmark themselves against the regulation which is already existing. So this process of identifying one set of principles is already like in place, it's going on. And we can see that it's definitely possible to somehow draw some conclusions. I mean, here I try to list all the regulation on AI that I could find. I'm sure that I forgot something, but we can see that this matrix is quite dense. There are a lot of ticks. We can see that there's a common theme around fairness. There's clearly a concern around explainability. There are concerns around the use of data, so data lineage and quality, including the need to be able to disclose which data was used to train the AI system. The same way you have ingredients on food labels. There are also obviously concerns around security and resiliency. I mean, AI systems are software systems, so security and resiliency remain a concern. There are concerns around accountability and traceability. Companies need to be able to prove and to show where decisions were made, by which AI systems, and they need to take accountability for it. There's a topic of privacy, obviously, and then there's something that I put a little bit separate, but it's a principle around proportionality with respect to risk. So there's a consensus that the degree of scrutiny an AI system should be subjected to should be proportional to the risk. But there's more than regulation. There are also frameworks and standards, starting with things that are a little bit more generic, like, for example, the Microsoft Fairness Checklist, the AI cards from Google that try to shape the discussion around the AI ethics. There are standards, IEEE, ISO, NIST, that concern, well, first of all, identification of risks. Secondly, AI processes, so what is called AI ops, these processes that take models through training, testing, deployment, and monitoring. And they also concern the control systems. So all the checks and balances that need to be in place in order to trust an AI system. Because it's clear that all the good general IT controls are not sufficient to tackle all the risks introduced by AI. And on top of that, just to complicate things even further, you have companies that need to be subjected to other kinds of regulation, including, for example, sustainability, privacy, cyber, consumer protection, sector-specific. There's tons of regulation. Now, we see that if we look at regulation, there's clearly concern about preventing fines, right? You need to be compliant because you don't want to pay fines. But if you look also at the standards, you see that regulators and those working on the standards are trying to help companies improve trust and resilience by better, we said, risk and controls and AI processes. We are still into the governance area. But companies are now moving even further, and they are including ethical AI principles into their code of conduct. And from my perspective, this is quite a big change in perspective, because it's no longer a compliance exercise, but it becomes a way for a company to invest in their reputation. We're talking about ethical branding and a way to generate value. Because it's clear that if you make an AI investment in your company reputation, you're going to be benefiting from better customer loyalty. Now, so far we said that you can turn this discussion around governance and ethical AI into a way to make a better business. Now the question is, we saw that there's a topic about proportionality. So the proportionality of risks, so the degree of scrutiny that the AI system should be subject to depends on the risk. And I mean, how do we measure this risk, right? One first way is to look at the definition of the role of a company in the eyes of the regulator. This is coming from the UI Act. And it's very interesting. You see that there are developers and deployers. It's clear that companies like OpenAI are developers. Who's a deployer then? Because the UI Act is a little bit cryptic about that. It's clear that you might become or turn into a developer from being just a deployer if there's a trademark applied to your product, but also if the intended purpose of the AI system is modified or there are substantial modifications to the AI system. And the question I get all the time is, well, how much do I have to modify my thing until I become a developer? And the reality is that so far we don't have a clear answer. We are not sure, companies are not sure. It's very hard to be sure about that. So companies try to resort to a risk-based approach. All right? So we have another dimension, which is the dimension of the risk. How do you estimate the risk? The first way is to look at the classification of a service in the UI Act. So depending on what your AI system does, the risk associated to it might change from low to high to prohibited. And it's clear that when the regulator put together this UI Act, that very specific topic is in mind. They had in mind the preservation of fundamental rights to employment, to housing, to access to financial services. They had in mind the preservation of the process in a judicial system or in the democracy. They also looked at prohibited services such as things concerning the exploitation of vulnerable groups, law enforcement, but I have to be honest, probably 80–90% of the companies out there, they are not concerned about anything like this. So, I mean, they might be tempted to say, fine, then my risk is really low risk. No worry about that. In reality, we see that this UI Act classification correlates really bad with a risk which is an estimate of the business impact. What happens to the business is something goes wrong. And it's clear that as an AI starts influencing significantly the performance of a product or even becomes client-facing, then, well, the risk dramatically increases. I mean, I put also there the HR department topic. There's also like a little bit of a landmine. I'm going to leave it on the side. Let's just look at a business impact classification of the AI system. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples because there I hope that you're going to see how the UAR classification does not correlate with the business impact risk. So I'm working with the robotics and industrial machines clients. client. They use machine learning to tune the operational parameters of a machine. First of all, this process of tuning the operational parameters of a robot is something developed in-house, so I suppose they can consider themselves as developers. Is it an AI? If we take the EU AI Act definition, I would say yes. It infers from data, they use IoT data, follows explicit objectives. Yes, they use an explicit policy for reinforcement learning. It generates an output, the aforementioned operational parameters, and the robot influences the physical environment, takes action. So yes, it's an AI. Is it a high-risk service? No, because it's not showing up in the Annex 3. But poor parameters lower the performance of the robot. They might get out of business if the performance is not good, and the competitors end up having robots that perform better. And poor parameters might even lead to malfunctioning, even harm to humans. So I would say that even if this is classified as a low-risk service, well, this exercise of tuning robot parameters is a high-risk activity. And the same applies to an e-commerce client of mine. And they are using generative AI and recommender system to generate and select service images. So which is displayed to clients when they go on the platform to promote travel, leisure, entertainment services. Now, is it developed in-house? Well, I'm not really sure because they're using services like DALL-E and they are wrapping things around it. But we said before, we don't know how much you can wrap around a service like DALL-E until you become yourself a developer. Is it an AI? Yeah, I would say so. Let's give it to them. They're using DALL-E. And is it a high-risk service? No. But the risk is high. And it's twofold, probably the same side of two sides of the same coin, right? On one hand, they have to deal with inclusivity because it's clear that if customers recognize themselves in the images, there's a higher probability that they're going to click and buy. This is inclusivity. At the same time, the lack of inclusivity, so somebody going on the web page and just saying white males, can lead to a public opinion backslash. So it's something they have to be very careful about that. It's a high-risk operation that they are having there. So even if most of the companies across industry feel that their risk classification does not capture the real business implications, they need and they can, however, go for a voluntary adoption because some recommendations there are valid. Now, we identified some principles, we went through the risk, and now the other topic is how easy it is to put together technical requirements. So now you have the principles, you need to translate them into the math. And here we see three things. I'm sorry, just a second. I am having hay fever. I'm trying my best not to cough in the microphone. So far, so good. Some tea is going to help. But all right, ethical principles. The first thing that can be pointed out is that ethical principles in some way can be considered a little bit meaningless. Ambiguous are many of the key terms used in AI ethics frameworks. Many key concepts in AI frameworks then are overburdened, brimming with the contradictory meanings. So, I mean, my favorite one is transparency. Everybody's saying that something has to be transparent. What does it mean? So transparency with respect to data, maybe transparency in the sense that the models should be open source as opposed to a black box model. Transparency in terms, perhaps, explainability. So being able to produce an indication of why an outcome was there instead of something else. Maybe even needed to present some counterfactuals, but it's not clear what the transparency really means. There's also another topic, which is the portability trap. So the portability trap is defined, and I have references there, as failure to understand how repurposing algorithmic solutions designed for one social context might be misleading, inaccurate, or otherwise do harm when applied to different contexts. I think the easiest way to explain this is through the example of fairness. Depending on what you're doing, you might have a very different definition of fairness. Do you want to have equality of outcome? Do you want to have equality of opportunity, for example? So you can't just take a definition of fairness and apply it all across the organization on all the use cases at hand. So you have a definition of fairness. You're going to also have a metric. There comes in the concept of epistemic trespassing, which says that metrics are not universal. Applying metrics outside their specific context introduces ethical harms. So if we take these, we see that all I'm saying with this epistemic trespassing idea is that, well, you can't just do things once. You have to do things use case by use case, go through this four-step process, every use case. And this hinders scalability. You cannot do it once and get done with the work. And we see that also technical requirements are contextual. So if we picture an AI system, I mean, it's a little bit of a simplification, but it's something that takes data and produces an outcome. We see that fairness starts with fairness in the data. We all read about bias. But in order to define bias, you need to define protected classes, right? We're talking about gender, race, but depending on certain context, that's not enough, and you might want to include other protected classes. Fairness impacts also how you build the model, because you might want to optimize your model for multi-objective, which includes some definition of performance, accuracy, and fairness. Or just optimize your model for accuracy, for instance, and then check in the outcome whether the outcome is fair with an ex post validation. So all these decisions are really specific to each use case, and it turns out that there's a debate there and it takes time. And we can also say something about the transparency there, which you need to be able to disclose the data used. But then also when it comes to the model, you need to agree on interpretability requirements. With interpretability requirements, I mean something like ex ante. For example, a linear regression that you look at the coefficients, you should be able to understand the impact of each feature. But you might not be interested in interpretability requirements. You might be interested in explainability. But again, there are a lot of trade-offs there. Faithfulness versus robustness, and whether you need, for example, something global versus local. Global is you're interested to understand whether certain decisions are made in a certain way on all the cases, or you're interested in getting some information on specific cases, to the point that you might need some counterfactuals as well in the process. Counterfactuals are examples that say what needs to change for an outcome to go from one outcome to another. Now, there's a lot of contextuality here, and I wanted to stress the topic with an example, and I'm trying to make an example which was something as less harmful as possible, such as recommending images for restaurants. You have some data, you have some priors, so you have some information about the client and what the system, what the client has been purchasing the system, some sort of product recommendation, implicit or explicit. So all these gets fed into this AI system, and the AI system picks images, making sure that is optimizing, for example, conversion, so making sure the customer are inclined to buy the services. And we can see that even in such as little harmful as possible example, well, things can be complicated because you still have a problem of inclusivity. If you put people in a restaurant, you want to make sure that they do not look all white and male, for instance. And you want to make sure that the user yourself identifies in what he's seeing. But then you want also to be specific in terms of like what you don't want to show. You don't want to show meat to vegans and vegetarians. You don't want to show food that from a religious or belief perspective might be offensive. You still want to be targeted because if somebody is a, what's in English, a teetotaler? So he tries to really skip alcohol and then you show him beers. It's like showing cigarettes to a smoker, no good, right? And then you need to try to be tacky, less tacky as possible, unless this is a little bit what you're trying to sell. So fairness is contextual, and we see the role played by inclusion. So fairness, in the eyes of a regulator, is defined as access to benefit or avoiding harm. And then you have personalization, product recommendation, for instance, which is about tailoring a product and a service to the needs of a user. And we see that inclusivity is what connects personalization to fairness. And then we see that if we take a personalization approach to fairness, we're going to realize that the human being is multidimensional. It's very hard to find protected classes in practice. And I can make some examples here. Turns out that according to research, taller people make more money. And in the US, 85% of college grads affected by autism are unemployed. So there's a big spectrum of dimensions for the human being that we need to consider. To summarize, what is the key learning is that you need to complement the fairness principle based on protected classes with inclusivity and diversity. And the moment you start talking about inclusivity, the EU AI Act becomes relevant across industries. A little bit of tea. If you're still with me, there's going to be a big so what. And the question is, what does this mean for operationalization? It means that you might still be able to put in place in an organization processes for lifecycle management and operation, the AI ops. You can work on risk and control frameworks. Again, centralized, all good. You can get scale there. But you can't get to what I call ethics as a service, which is being able to define ethical principles at corporate level that you can translate in generally applicable technical requirements that you can validate centrally. And this is the biggest challenge in my perspective, at least, in the operationalization of AI governance. Still, I managed not to cough. I thank you all for the time.